Welcome. This presentation is designed to assist community schools and sponsors with supporting regular attendance. My name is Carl Koenig. I'm the Director of the Office of Community Schools, and I'm joined today by Brittany Miracle from our Office of Integrated Student Supports. Our presentation is going to provide information related to understanding regular attendance, providing definitions of attendance, an overview of Ohio attendance laws, and answer some specific questions related to Ohio attendance laws for community schools. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Brittany, who's going to talk about preparing all students for success.
Thank you, Carl. Ohio's strategic plan, Each Child, Our Future, emphasizes the need to address the whole child to make sure that every student in Ohio is prepared, challenged, and empowered to become a lifelong learner. In order to do this, we must build systems and break down barriers that prevent students from attending school regularly. When students are not in school, they are not benefiting from high-quality instruction, enrichment activities and interventions, and valuable social experiences. There are many lessons, inside and out of the classroom, that cannot be duplicated or made up at home. It's important for us to get every student in Ohio to attend school regularly. So why do we focus on attendance? Good attendance is important starting in kindergarten. We know that students with good attendance in kindergarten and first grade are more likely to read on grade level by third grade. By sixth grade, poor attendance is a risk factor for students of dropping out of high school. Additionally, students' attendance in eighth grade can predict better attendance and graduation outcomes than standardized test scores in middle school. And lastly, a student's attendance in the previous year can predict their attendance in the future and current school years. So what that means is you don't have to wait for a student to have attendance problems to be able to wrap supports around them. So why else do we focus on attendance? We know that it is cyclical. Early absenteeism may have lasting impacts on students' educational trajectories through adulthood. We know that chronic absenteeism is often linked with outcomes of poverty. We also know that students of families who don't have a high school degree are more likely to be chronically absent. It is really important to address absenteeism early by engaging families to understand the importance of education and regular attendance. So there are a lot of reasons why students are absent. It could be housing instability, health-related issues, uncertainty of new environments, and unsafe routes to and from school. But it's important that attendance problems doesn't necessarily link to any certain demographic. Any student at any point in their educational career could be at risk for attendance issues. A student who is a high achiever who doesn't necessarily always have attendance problems could see themselves in a family crisis that then they would need supports to get to school. So it's really important that when we are talking about attendance, that we're not just talking about a specific group of students, but keeping all of Ohio's students in mind. So you may have heard the buzzword chronic absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism is linked to Ohio's Every Student Succeeds plan, and we are also working towards reducing chronic absenteeism as part of Ohio's accountability system and school and district report cards. But what is chronic absenteeism? Chronic absenteeism is defined as missing 10% or more of the school year for any reason. That includes excused or unexcused absences. I know it seems counterintuitive to consider unexcused or in both excused absences in this calculation, but the fact is it doesn't matter why a student isn't at school. If they're not at school, they're missing out on valuable learning. Did you know that missing 2 days a month, every month of the school year, could lead a student to be chronically absent? It's really important to talk with families early and often and help them track the absences that a student has. The school year is long, September through May. Families can lose track of the number of absences their students have had and might not realize that 2 days a month really does add up. So we've talked about chronic absenteeism, but how is it different than average daily attendance? Average daily attendance has been the traditional measure that the state and many other states have used to measure attendance, but it doesn't show the full picture. Average daily attendance is a district or school level measure. So what it does is it takes all of the possible days all of the students could be in school, and it's divided by all of the days that all of the students in the school attended. So what that means is it's an aggregate measure of all of the possible attendance days of all of the students in the school. So it can mask certain students' attendance, because if you have one student that has perfect attendance and one student that's only in school half the time, that averages out to be an acceptable attendance rate. What we see is most students most of the time have decent attendance, while some students some of the time have really poor attendance. And if we're not looking at a student level measure such as chronic absenteeism, we really are missing critical data that we could be using to drill down and align student supports. So how's chronic absenteeism different than truancy? Truancy counts only unexcused absences, and it emphasizes compliance and takes a punitive approach by engaging the justice system and the legal system. On the flip side, chronic absenteeism counts all absences because, as I mentioned, it doesn't matter why a student's not in school. If they're missing instruction, then they're missing opportunity. It emphasizes the impact of missed days, but takes a preventative approach. Like I said, using data from the previous year, you can plan for the current year to understand what support students might need before they become absent. It also emphasizes community strategies, family engagement, and positive ways to engage a student to come to school instead of the threat of having truancy charges brought down on the family.
So thinking about this as looking at all students across the state, did you know that the average chronic absenteeism rate in the state of Ohio is approximately 16%? To put that into context, 16% of our students are missing more than 10% of the academic year. And as we've already specified, that's 18 days of instruction that students are potentially missing out on. As you can see, this is not something that is unique to one type of school in particular, and we know the focus today is about community schools, but an absence is something that is an issue across typology. There are instances and issues related to attendance in rural areas, in urban, very high poverty areas, there are issues, and where a lot of our community schools come from, being in challenged school districts, it would makes sense that their percentage aligns to kind of somewhere in the middle between the high end of those pieces. And it isn't something that can be broken down to say that it's one specific subgroup or another. On this slide, you can see that we break down the rate across the state, across all subgroups, and even within there, you're going to see issues. Now, an example may be in just thinking of this kind of as an outsider, you may think that gifted students would not have an issue with absenteeism, while the challenges that they may present related to why they are not in school may be different than, let's say, a family who is identified as economically disadvantaged. It is still something to consider because it's an engagement issue. You could have students and you have this thought that gifted students are going to be more that participate, they want to be at school, they're achieving at a high level, but they may have anxiety. There could be other issues that relate to why that particular student is not attending school. And again, what we're trying to get to with this measure is looking at to make sure that students are provided with as many opportunities for learning as possible. So having them in school is considered a benefit. With your individual school, you'd want to break down and look at where your students are falling because you may not have a one-size-fits-all approach in addressing absenteeism issues within your school. We talked about this earlier, but looking at absenteeism by grade level, you see the kindergarten has one of the higher rates when you're talking about the elementary grades. And if you think about it, that's one of the most critical times when engaging our youngest learners. So focusing and coming up with strategies, especially if you are a K-8 or K-4 community school, how do you get that level of engagement with your youngest learners? So that way you're not setting up and I don't want to say issue, but something that needs to be managed or a problem. How do you address that? So looking at your youngest grade levels, what are the barriers? What are the issues? Talking to some of your families about what are the barriers preventing the student to showing up. This will help prevent and can be a strategy to help reduce this issue, especially in kindergarten, because as you see and as we spoke about earlier, that information in the rates go up as students progress in the education system, especially in the high school ages. We wanted to provide some data specific to community schools. So the overall rate for community schools specific is about 30.8 looking at the most recent data. When looking at the chronic absenteeism rate for brick and mortar community schools, it's about 28.5. We have specific community schools that deal with dropout prevention and recovery students. So these students are already identified as being behind, are facing significant life challenges. So you would expect that that number would be higher in terms of their attendance rate. But the number on the screen shows that they are missing more than 18 days in an academic year. And for students that are already behind, that can be a struggle, especially as they're working to demonstrate competency to move on and recover credits so that way they can graduate with the particular cohort. This should not come up as a surprise to anyone who works primarily with dropout prevention and recovery community schools, but this is something that we do need to kind of have thoughtful strategies on how to address that specifically with our most needy students. And for online rate, it's a little bit below what the average would be. Statewide, this could be attributed to just having access to content that fits a schedule outside of a traditional school day, which may lend itself to more engagement by students. But that's one idea. That's not necessarily going to be the total answer.
Great, so now you've seen some data at the state level and you have thought about ways that you can look at data in your particular school, but when do you intervene? When do you address absenteeism? The answer is early and often. You should look at data before the school year begins, and especially, as Carl mentioned, those kindergarten students, start engaging before the school year because you don't want a student to start the year already behind. Another important time is before and after breaks. So a lot of times if there's a Monday off, students will take that Friday before off as well. We've also found that districts and community schools that do half PD days, they see a higher absenteeism rate on those days as well. And looking at your own data to know when students are most likely to miss school. You should analyze the data regularly, so best practice would be looking at your data at least twice a month and really drilling into the student subgroups and the grades that Carl had mentioned. So how can we reduce chronic absenteeism? So House Bill 410 was passed a couple years ago, really to encourage and support preventative approach to excessive absences and truancy. House Bill 410 put in place provisions to really help students get re-engaged in the school system before they're introduced into the justice system for truancy. We know that once a student is introduced into the legal system, they're likely to see more introduction throughout their school trajectory. So something like truancy that we could manage with the family and the school, that's really best where it should be prevented. House Bill 410 changed definitions. So habitual truancy was changed to align with hours instead of days. This was just a technical cleanup to align with previous law that changed the minimum school year from days to hours. So it only made sense that the truancy definition aligned with that. Habitual truancy means that a student is consecutively absent without an excuse for 30 hours, or 42 hours in a month without legitimate excuse, or 72 hours in a year without legitimate excuse. House Bill 410 included this excessive absences provision. This was new with House Bill 410. And if a student misses 38 or more hours without legitimate excuse in a month, or 65 hours without legitimate excuse in a school year, they are excessively absent. But the key is that the same thing is true if a student has excused absences or absent with legitimate excuse. So excessive absence includes with or without legitimate excuse. And then lastly, House Bill 410 included language around chronic absenteeism, which Ohio defines as 10% or more of the school year with or without legitimate excuse. Other key changes in House Bill 410 include removing excessive truancy from a local zero tolerance policy. What that means is students cannot be suspended or expelled for being truant. Districts are also required to develop a plan to address excessive absences before students become habitually truant. And this language is a little confusing because this is really pointing to district policy or community school policy around preventing attendance issues. The word plan gets a little tricky, and I'll talk more about that later. So other key changes is schools must provide students with an opportunity to make up work due to suspensions. So House Bill 410 allowed this to be a may, but House Bill 318 last fall updated this to say that students must be given the opportunity to make up their work. And then lastly, students cannot be required to make up any suspensions the following school year. So if there are 10 days left in the school year and a student is suspended for 15 days, that student cannot be made to make up that 5 days of suspension at the beginning of the next year. What can happen is over the summer that student could be required to do a different type of engagement activity such as community service or remedial classes to make up that time of suspension. So as I mentioned, excessive absences is 38 hours or more in 1 month with or without legitimate excuse, or 65 hours or more in a year with or without legitimate excuse. So when a student hits one of these triggers, the community school or district must do the following. So they have to notify the family in writing. This could be a note home in an agenda book, it could be an email, it could be a friendly note from the teacher. It doesn't have to be certified mail, and it doesn't have to elicit any threat of truancy. Really, it could just be, hey, we missed your student, they've accumulated this many absences, let us know if you need assistance. One of the misnomers about HASPA 410 was that these letters had to mention truancy or say that the student was on course for truancy, which is not necessarily true, because if all of the absences were excused, they would be excessively absent, but nowhere near hitting the truancy mark. In addition to notifying the family, you have to follow your school or district plan for addressing attendance issues. So what this means is you should update your school policy for what is your plan for addressing that. Some schools use PBIS as a way to engage early and often. Some schools are a little bit more strict and say that they would engage families after school or on Saturdays to prevent further absences. It's really up to you, but just make sure that whatever you come up with meets the needs of you, your students, and your students' families. And then lastly, as appropriate, you could refer to community resources such as housing, food banks, or mental behavioral health. So habitual truancy is the actual truancy provision. It's not related to excessive absences. They are two separate provisions, so it's not a stair step. You would think of them as two separate triggers. A student would be habitually truant if they are absent 30 or more consecutive hours without legitimate excuse, absent 42 hours or more in 1 calendar month without legitimate excuse, or absent 72 or more hours in 1 school year without legitimate excuse. So what do you do when a student becomes habitually truant? You have to provide written notice to the parents. The actual requirement is 3 engagement activities. So whatever you define that as in your school policy, it could be 3 phone calls, it could be a home visit, a phone call and a letter, but you have to actively engage the parent 3 times to invite them to participate in an absence intervention team. So then you assign the student to an absence intervention team, and this team develops an absence intervention plan, and it should also outline supports that the school, the family, and the community can utilize to make sure the student gets to school every day. Now, you should have engaged the family 3 times to participate, but we know that not all families are going to be able to or want to. So if that's the case, your team should meet without the parent. You need to develop the plan and then provide the plan in writing to the parent if the parent's not able to show up. If the child fails to make progress on the plan, then the district can file a complaint with court or the community school. So other requirements for habitually truant, you could provide counseling if it's available in your school. You could request in partnership with the county juvenile court that the parent attend different types of parent involvement classes. You may notify the registrar of motor vehicles. There are other provisions in place. You can't do this unless there are other things that happen in tandem. And then ultimately you would take legal action if the habitual truancy continues or the absence intervention plan did not work. So a bit more about the absence intervention team. Districts and community schools with a chronic absenteeism rate above 5% will establish an absence intervention team for students who are habitually truant. The last time I checked, this requirement applied to all community schools in the state and all but 84 school districts. So by and large, all schools, community schools, and districts are doing this across the state. So an absence intervention team, the purpose is really to establish that student-centered absence intervention plan by identifying specific barriers and solutions to the student's attendance needs. Each team must, these are the musts, include a representative from the school or the district, another representative from the school or the district who has a relationship with the child. So you could think of the first one being a school counselor or an administrator, the second one being anybody from a teacher to a cafeteria worker to a bus driver. And then the last one is the parent or parent's designee. So if the parent works and can't come to the school, they are entitled to send anybody who has a relationship with that child on their behalf. So this is the core of the team. But it's recommended that additional members include any student support worker that the student could benefit from having in the room. So that includes counselors, social workers, the special education coordinator if the student's on an IEP, representatives from public or nonprofit agencies. This is particularly important if the student's in foster care. We want to make sure that the student's education and supports are seamless. So if the student's having truancy issues and also has an open case with Children's Services should be invited to the table. All right, so now Carl and I will answer some frequently asked questions. These are questions that we get most often. So Carl, are community schools required to follow House Bill 410 provisions?
Yes, they are. There is nothing in statute that would exclude a community school from complying with the pieces and parts that we talked about for the must earlier in the presentation.
So Carl, sometimes there's confusion around the 72-hour withdrawal rule. How does it impact House Bill 410 requirements?
So the 72-hour withdrawal rule is a mechanism that student or community schools can engage in for removing students who have missed 72 consecutive hours of the school. But if you think about what we've talked about for students who to be identified as either excessively absent or habitually truant, the steps that it should have been taken as part of complying with 410 regarding the development of an absent intervention team, other pieces would have come in. They all should still apply. Their triggers, one thing to note is that the 72-hour withdrawal is consecutive hours to where chronic absenteeism or to be considered habitually truant, a student could be absent 72 hours without legitimate excuses, but those wouldn't be consecutive. So there is a little bit of nuance difference, but you should be implementing best practices for students who are on that trajectory to meet the 72-hour withdrawal rule.
Okay, is there a process for transferring student records?
Yes, there should be. As community schools have practice in both enrolling students and in some instances unenrolling students throughout the school year, they should have a policy on what they do with the student in terms of transferring records when they withdraw from the school. One of the things to remember, and this is something that with the advent of 410, you may have information and data points related to steps you have taken successfully and maybe in some instances unsuccessfully with the development of your absent intervention team. That's information that could be critical, especially as a student engages in their next learning opportunity. What I would say is think about it this way. If you were enrolling a student who had attendance issues coming from another, either a public district, another community school, even a non-public school, what would you want to see? What would be helpful for you, especially for dropout recovery schools as you're developing those individualized learning plans? As much information as you can provide about successes, things that didn't work, notes that will help us make sure that the student finds an educational opportunity that's best for them. That's absolutely something that should be considered when transferring student records. One thing to note, if you have a student with disabilities, you must transfer a full record. Include any information related to the absent intervention team. That should be a kind of a no-brainer, but that is something that isn't thought of because what's the most important thing? The IEP. But this information kind of supports that as well. So Brittany, how should attendance be tracked and reported?
House Bill 410 requires attendance to be tracked and reported at least by the hour. So this aligns again with the minimum school year requirement of hourly reporting. But that doesn't mean that it can't be tracked in more minute detail. So we have some community schools and districts that are literally tracking attendance by the minute. We have others that track by the half hour, but the bare minimum is keeping track of student attendance by the hour.
Do tardies count toward excessive absent and habitually truant triggers?
Yes, tardies do count. If you think of tardies as just time out of school rather than the label of tardy, you would just track the attendance or the absence by the hour. So if your attendance policy is to round to the nearest hour, if a student is 45 minutes late for school, then they will have accumulated 1 hour of absence. If your attendance policy is to track and report by the minute, then that student was out of school for 45 minutes, so they have 45 minutes on their absence record.
What is considered excused and unexcused absences?
It's a great question. So, House Bill 410 did not change any requirement around excused or unexcused absences. So, by and large, anything that a community school or district was considering excused or unexcused prior to 410, you could continue to consider that. We do have administrative code, which is 3301-6902, that outlines the minimum of what has to be excused. But by and large, community schools and districts should rely on their attendance policy to drive excused and unexcused absences. For example, there's nothing in law or administrative code around how vacations need to be considered. That is really driven by local policy. Some districts and community schools allow for 5 days of excused time for family vacations as long as the process is followed, so there's notice and the student makes up their work. Other community schools and districts say no, we will not allow any excused absences for family vacations. So it's a great example of how it varies throughout the state depending on family needs.
Do students who are excessively absent need an absent intervention plan?
No. Students who are excessively absent do not need to be put on an absence intervention plan. Absence intervention plans are specifically for students who are habitually truant, and this is the step before truancy filings are taken to court. So students who are excessively absent absolutely should have supports and a plan for those supports, but that wouldn't be called an absence intervention plan. Absence intervention plan is the first step before going to court. Excessively absent students are absent for many reasons because this includes excused and unexcused absences. So when a student becomes excessively absent, you need to look at the reasons why and align supports that way. Certainly you can create a plan, but that plan should never be used to take a student to court who is not actually habitually truant.
So another way of thinking about it, there are some best practices that can come from this that could be utilized to help students who are excessively absent, but there is a difference, and it's pretty important to understand that difference.
Absolutely. And when communicating excessively absent triggers and supports around excessively absent students with families, you should not ever use the word truant because they're not truant, and likely students who are excessively absent will not become truant.
How do suspensions count toward excessive absence or habitual truancy triggers?
So this is a tricky one. Suspensions count, they do count towards excessive absence triggers. However, they don't count towards habitual truancy triggers. And the reason for this is that the law says legitimate reason to be out of school. And a suspension is a legitimate reason to be out of school. So while it might be an unexcused absence, it would not count towards a habitual truancy trigger, with the thought being that a student shouldn't then face another consequence of their previous behavior in addition to the suspension. However, because excessive absence includes excused and unexcused absences, then that student would potentially be excessively absent.
Do students who are excessively absent need an absent intervention plan?
No. No, we already addressed that one, so I apologize for the duplicative slide.
That was my bad. Last formalized question, what are the requirements for an 18-year-old?
18-year-old students are still entitled to a free and appropriate education, even if they're not compulsory age. So what that means is students who are 18 are not subjected to any of the House Bill 410 requirements, but because they're so entitled to their free and appropriate education, they still should be provided supports to get to school every day. So as Carl mentioned, implementing those best practices for students under 18. You should also provide the same supports for students who are 18 and struggling to get to school. Should there be an instance that you're trying to withdraw an 18-year-old student, the best way to go about that is to document all of your attempts to engage the student and use EMIS Help Desk as a tool to understand if it really is the best approach. Certainly, we want to do everything possible to keep students in school, but we do understand there might be instances that it's appropriate to withdraw a student.
Last question, where can I find more information if this is something as I'm engaging in my improvement plans and I want to focus more information, where are there resources available?
Yeah, so the department's website is a great resource. If you go and just go to the ODE's webpage and search chronic absenteeism, the page that comes up has a few different categories of materials you can use. One is just supports around House Bill 410. So we have a model policy, we have an absence intervention plan template, but we also have a section about how do you support regular attendance. We have sample letters that you can use. We have different ways to communicate with parents and different ideas for Tier 1 activities to really encourage the regular attendance. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to either Carl or our school improvement inbox or my email directly, which is on the screen here. The school improvement inbox is school_improvement@education.ohio.gov. And I answer those questions as well, so it doesn't matter which one you email.
And if you email the community school improvement mailbox, which is csimprovement@education.ohio.gov, we will absolutely make sure that that information gets sent. So that way we're providing information and showing a collaborative partnership with the Office of Integrated Student Support. We hope that this presentation today provides information to you as you sit down to address concerns that you've been facing. We understand that community schools are often faced with challenges with enrolling students because they don't have the same kind of steady enrollment patterns that a traditional district would. But as and once those students decide that this is the educational setting that is best for them, how do we help address some of these issues to make sure that they are in attendance, meeting the mission and vision of your community schools? So as we get more information and we find more supports or there's more requests for the field, feel free to send those to us. And if we feel, we'll continue to provide more resources. So thank you for your time today. And if you have questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us.